Good day. This is John Montagna. I've been asked to talk to you today about best practices in the role of the press in disseminating sensitive information to the public. This is a very important topic. The press is very important to the welfare and good governance of any country, any civilization, any people. And so it's worth talking about this for a few minutes to see where we stand, to have some food for thought, and think about the things that we need to think about. And I thought that I would start it out by quoting a few famous Americans who have spoken upon the topic. So let's think about what they have to say. This is Thomas Jefferson. He was an early American president and statesman. And he said, "Our liberty depends upon the freedom of the press, and that cannot be limited without being lost." That's a very important statement, and it's a statement from 200 years ago, because he recognized, as did many of the founding fathers of the United States of America, that their freedom and the welfare and prosperity of society was dependent upon accurate reporting by the press and unlimited reporting by the press, because that is what kept a check upon government, that the press was there to provide a check upon government that was very important. Another well-known American said this: "The government's power to censor the press was abolished so that the press would remain forever free to censure the government. The press was protected so that it could bear the secrets of government and inform the people. Only a free and unrestrained press can effectively expose deception in government." I think that statement is very self-explanatory. The role of the press is really to keep the government's power in check. In order to achieve that, the government cannot have excessive control over what the press does. So that's a very important statement. Another famous American statesman said this, James Madison, who was one of our presidents, again, a couple of hundred years ago. But he said this: "The people shall not be deprived or abridged of their right to speak or to publish their sentiments, and the freedom of the press, as one of their great bulwarks of liberty, shall be inviolable." Again, that's a very important, profound statement by a man who clearly saw the role of the press, the newspapers in society, and their role as both a voice for the people and a check against any excesses by the government. So again, a very important statement. Franklin Roosevelt, a president from the 20th century of the United States. "Freedom of the press is essential to the preservation of a democracy. But there is a difference between freedom and license. Editorialists who tell downright lies in order to advance their own agendas do more to discredit the press than all the censors in the world." Now, this is a very contrary view, but it's important as well, because what it does is express the fact that what the press does is important, and that the press, therefore, has a great responsibility to be accurate and to be objective in what it does. Because if the goal of the press, of any member of the press, any newspaper, is to advance a particular agenda, to further a particular viewpoint, then that is very damaging to the very thing that the press is there to protect. So Roosevelt saw that the press, given great power, had necessarily a great deal of responsibility to go with it. And this quote illustrates that. Next, "If you don't read the newspaper, you're uninformed. If you read the newspaper, you're misinformed." This is Mark Twain. He was an American humorist of the 19th century. This is a kind of a flip quote in the sense that he's being humorous here. But it also goes to the previous quote here, which is that a newspaper which chooses to misinform can misinform a lot of people, because people tend to believe what's in the newspaper. And for many people, it's the only thing they consistently read. So once again, the power of the press is illustrated here. The duty upon the press to not misinform people is hinted at here. Because, as Twain says, if you read the newspaper and it's the wrong newspaper, you are misinformed. You're not informed at all. So all of that illustrates the power of the press and the duty of the press to be responsible with this great power that it inherits in any free society. And finally, this quote from another cynic, a well-known American writer named H.L. Mencken. A newspaper is a device for making the ignorant more ignorant and the crazy crazier. And this goes back to Mr. Twain and President Roosevelt, who again understand through these comments the great power of the press and the great responsibility of the press, and what happens when the press does not take that responsibility with appropriate gravity and seriousness. Because at the end of the day, if in fact a newspaper or any other news outlet is not ethical, does not have high standards, these are the kinds of things that can happen. People can be misinformed, and ignorant people remain ignorant or maybe become more ignorant because they're given bad facts. And as we have seen in the 21st century, the news and news outlets and social media and all of these things can in fact make the crazy crazier, and is responsible for a good deal of terrorism and other bad activity in the world as a result. So knowing all of these things, let's think about the principles of journalism. We can say as a general proposition that journalism has the following principles that should be applied by ethical practitioners. First of all, the question of truthfulness. A good journalist, I think it goes without saying, or perhaps it doesn't go without saying, but certainly a good journalist should be concerned with the truth. Reporting should be true. It should be about facts. It shouldn't be invented. It shouldn't be half-truths. It shouldn't be rumors. It should be truthful facts. And the journalist has an obligation to ensure that it is, in fact, truthful facts. Second, accuracy. It's one thing to report a fact. It's another thing to report a complex fact accurately. And again, a journalist who is an ethical practitioner has a duty to report facts accurately. That means necessarily checking their sources, ensuring that the things that they believe to be true as a part of their reporting are in fact true, and that they understand them with sufficient fullness to satisfy themselves that the things that they say in their report are in fact both truthful and accurate. Next, objectivity. Every person has an opinion, every person has a voice, but the role of the reporter is to report on things as objectively as they can, and insofar as is possible to remove their own prejudices, their own opinions, their own positions on things from their reporting, because the goal is to state what has happened, not to state what one's opinion is about what is happening. If one wants to state one's opinions, one can become an editorial writer, or one can become an author or something else. The goal of a journalist is to be objective. Next, impartiality. This is a challenging one sometimes. The journalist is not supposed to take sides. So in reporting on a dispute, the journalist reports the dispute, but the goal is to be objective in that reporting, going to our previous principle, and to state the dispute without taking the part of either side in the dispute. One of the things we're seeing about both objectivity and impartiality in the United States right at this moment is that those are becoming increasingly difficult things to do as newspaper outlets become more partisan. And the major newspaper outlets in the United States, for example, right now have become fairly partisan, and they're ignoring quite a lot their duties of objectivity and impartiality as they take sides in political matters. So this becomes a problem, and I think it's become a problem in many countries. Next, fairness. This goes very strongly towards all of the things that come before it, because at the end of the day, if you are accurate, if you are objective, and if you are impartial, then your reporting should be fair to all the parties that you're reporting on. Anytime you fail to be truthful or accurate or objective or impartial, I think your fairness is called into question. And at the end of the day, that fairness is a very important factor in good journalism. And finally, public accountability. This is important. Whether a journalist cares to accept the fact or not, the reality is that what a journalist does, what a newspaper does, affects the society of which that journalist and that newspaper are a part. And so there is a public accountability aspect of this for all of the other things. The newspaper, the reporter, the journalist should expect accountability with respect to how truthful they have been, how accurate they have been, how objective they have been, how impartial they have been, and how fair they have been. So a newspaper reporter, a newspaper outlet of any kind, is not itself above censure when it fails to meet these duties that it has. And I think that's important to bear in mind. So considering all of that, we must next consider the complex role of news outlets in the real world. News outlets try to be objective and impartial, but the reality is that they are not totally external to the events they report. You know, if you are in the field of physics, you understand that the act of measurement inherently changes the system it's trying to measure. And so that is true of news reporting. Whether or not a news reporter likes it, what they report and how they report it and whom they report it to becomes a part of the narrative. It becomes part of the story. It becomes part of the social process that's going on. That's completely unavoidable. No matter how hard you try it, the fact of the matter is that what you are doing influences people. It potentially changes events. It can certainly influence the perception of events. And all of these things necessarily mean that the reporting becomes part of the event. Likewise, reporting inherently gives voice to many people and many groups of people. And not all of them are good actors. It is certainly a noteworthy and commendable thing to publicize, for example, a speech by a politician during a political campaign, because that's how people become informed, and that's all well and good. And it's good to report on statements by important public figures and perhaps even by ordinary citizens. All of those things are good things, but newspaper reporting necessarily gives voice sometimes to bad actors. These can be criminals, they can be terrorist groups, they can be state actors that are not good actors. There are all kinds of bad actors out there. And in every case, the reporter necessarily gives voice to them if they're going to report the entire story. And that may or may not be a good thing. It's a very hard call sometimes as to whether or not that is a good thing. And so that's a real challenge for any news outlet, is the reality that one, they're becoming part of the story themselves when they report, and number two, they give voice to a great many groups and people, many of whom are not necessarily the best representatives of society. And that comes with the nature of reporting, so you can't avoid it. When you think of all of that, you have also to think of the question of objectivity and impartiality. As I said before, whether we care to acknowledge it or not, each of us has a voice and an opinion. No one of us is truly and completely objective in what we say and what we do. We all have some viewpoint. We all have some agenda of our own that is part of our life. It's part of the fabric of whom we are. And everyone's voice inevitably colors their own statements and their own actions to some extent. We would like to think, each of us, that we can be completely impartial, but that's very, very difficult to do in any circumstance. And when you are a newspaper reporter or journalist of any kind, and you are reporting on difficult, challenging aspects of society, difficult, challenging events, it becomes very, very difficult, perhaps impossible, to eliminate your own voice from the story that you're reporting on. You obviously have a duty to try, insofar as possible, to achieve that, but it's very difficult to completely do it. So any newspaper reporter necessarily, no matter what they're reporting on, but particularly when the subject matter is sensitive or challenging or or otherwise difficult for society. It becomes very difficult for to be truly impartial and objective, and not to color the story. So it becomes a question of how do you minimize that more than how do you eliminate it entirely. Because, as I said, I think it's impossible for any of us to completely eliminate our own personality, our own judgments, our own thoughts from the things that we say and write. The challenge of accuracy is increasingly a problem too. It is increasingly the case in the world, you see this a lot these days, that news outlets do not check facts the way that they used to and check their sources the way that they used to. And that impacts the accuracy of what is reported, and that therefore impacts all of the other things that we talked about with respect to the principles of journalism. Okay? And it happened, going back to Mark Twain's quote, it creates a situation where untruthful or partially untruthful information is being reported as true. And that's an extremely challenging situation because once these half-truths and partial truths and somewhat truths and untruths make it into the world, they take on a life of their own. People accept them as true because people, this is part of the great responsibility that the press has. People read a newspaper and they assume it to be an accurate, impartial source of information, whether it is or not. And if the newspaper, even inadvertently, publishes inaccurate, untruthful information, people will read it and assume that it is true. And that becomes a very big problem because once that is out there, a retraction usually is not very effective. Okay? Mostly is not very effective. And the untruthful, inaccurate information takes a life of its own on in the world, and you never really put it back in the bottle. And that is an enormous problem for newspapers when increasingly they're on smaller budgets, increasingly on tighter deadlines to publish. This potential for this kind of unwanted inaccuracy to get out into the world and become wild is a real serious problem. Which brings us to sensitive information. And when we speak of sensitive information, I think it's important to bear in mind that sensitive information is not a thing. It's many things. Many more things that I have listed here. Here are only a few examples. So it could be personal information. It could be financial data or health data about an individual that most people will find sensitive. I don't think any of us would like to see our bank account information published. I don't think most of us would like to see a list of our illnesses published in the newspaper, and so all of these are sensitive things. That's not to say that there aren't occasions when publishing these things is legitimate and important, but they are sensitive. The people whose information they are will regard them as very sensitive information. Another common example that's a subject of quite a lot of debate is embarrassing information about crime victims. So, oftentimes an innocent person will have embarrassing facts about them. For example, a rape victim. A rape victim typically does not want this publicized because it is an embarrassing crime. It's a humiliating crime, and they do not want their information to be in a newspaper on the front page. Other crime information may be similar. The victim does not want it to become generally known that they have become a victim of a crime, for example, some financial swindle or something like that. So there are lots of crime victims for whom the information about their crime and their victimhood is a very sensitive issue. Other kinds of information that is potentially sensitive is, for example, information that may be valuable to criminals, terrorists, and other bad actors. And this is a topic of a good deal of debate in the journalistic community in this day and age, because if, for example, a journalist becomes privy, however they may become privy to it, to information about an ongoing investigation about a terrorist group or a criminal group or some such group, should they publish it? If, in fact, that will assist the criminals or terrorists in avoiding that investigation or hiding from that investigation. That's a real ethical dilemma. The information may be very interesting and very meaningful to the public, but if in so publishing it you're aiding and abetting the criminals, is that a good idea? That's a hard question to answer sometimes. And then finally, another one that you commonly see is personal scandals such as divorces and affairs and other personal peccadillos that will arise in the lives of many people, and that are commonly grist for various kinds of yellow journalists who are looking to sell copies of their newspaper and who find this sort of stuff very attractive. So when we think about all of these kinds of things, we have to think about the role of news outlets in society. Observers and reporters, yes, that is what in fact a news outlet is. The intended role, if we think back to Madison and Jefferson and some of the founders of my society, they saw newspapers as observers and reporters of the truth, and their goal was to expose wrongdoing. Their duty was to expose wrongdoing and to shine light upon the workings of government, among other things. But are there other larger responsibilities? There could be. So when we think of victims, do we have an obligation as journalists to protect them? That's a subject of quite a lot of debate. Okay? What about the protection and defense of society at large from people like terrorists? Does the journalist have a duty to potentially withhold information in the service of the general welfare of society? That is also something that is heavily debated. And likewise, and concurrently with that, refusing to be a voice and outlet for bad actors. Oftentimes, and we see this a lot these days, where terrorist groups will record a manifesto of some kind, and one of their goals is to see that manifesto published in the news, because that is their publicity outlet. They don't have a publicity agency, they don't have an ad agency. What they have is the newspaper and television and other media outlets, and their goal is to use those media outlets, all of them, as a voice for their own agenda. And again, these are just a few of the examples that are out there. Any of these could potentially be another kind of duty that a news outlet has. So it's a balancing act when you get right down to it. We saw earlier our general ethical principles, and they are sound. And certainly I think virtually every ethical journalist in the world would agree with them, regardless of what country you may be from or what news outlet you are a reporter for. But there are other considerations that must be borne in mind. The intended audience, right? Do we publish very, very explicit information about crimes or sexual matters or things of that sort to an audience that might be children, for example? That's a good question, right? The potential effect upon the audience. Will people be unduly shocked? I think part of the duty of a newspaper reporter is to shock people sometimes. But will they be unduly shocked? Do we publish, for example, gruesome photographs of murder victims that have been hacked to pieces? We have to think about that. Okay. Another kind of effect is what if we're publishing a terrorist manifesto? Do we really want impressionable young teenagers to read that terrorist manifesto and potentially become radicalized by it? You have to think of those kinds of things as well, because increasingly that's a problem. What about the potential effect of the people who are being reported upon, the crime victims, the people whose personal scandals have all of a sudden become newsworthy? Oftentimes the publishing of that information can be very damaging to these people. And a newspaper reporter, I think, has an obligation to take that kind of effect into consideration. And all of these point to the larger role of newspapers and other media in society. Because again, the basic ethical principles are sound, but whether we like it or not, whether we choose to admit it or not, a newspaper has all of these other potential effects as well. And what is the larger role of a newspaper or a media outlet when these other effects and potential effects on people in society are taken into consideration? The fact of the matter is that there are no easy answers to any of this. Everything that we have just talked about is subject to considerable debate by journalists around the world. There are consensuses that have been built. So, for example, in the United States, it is typically the case that victims of sexual crimes do not have their names published in the newspaper. But other kinds of things are not subject to consensus. And the consensus is by no means universal. It's important to bear that in mind. So at the end of the day, every journalist has to make choices. Okay? First of all, thinking to our basic principles, do I believe that this information is accurate? If it's not, if you don't believe it's accurate, if you, as the reporter, do not believe it's accurate, you probably have no business publishing it, right? Second of all, do I believe that the public good is being served by reporting this information? That's a more complex question, because what is the public good? Okay, then you have to start defining the public good. And the public good is certainly, as we saw from Jefferson and Madison and some of these other commentators, the public good is in many cases served by rigorous and detailed reporting of facts, however embarrassing they might be to someone. That is the nature of the media's role as a watchdog upon government. But other things, it's tougher. Do you publish people's names when information is personally embarrassing to them? Do you believe at the end of the day that the public good outweighs any damage to individuals? Because when you start naming names in a newspaper, that can be a humiliation. It certainly shines a spotlight on them and their life. And in many cases, that's highly undesirable for them. Is the public good such that it outweighs whatever damage it may do to these individuals? In many cases, yes. When you're exposing a corrupt politician and his or her extravagant lifestyle that's coming from the public fisc, yes, absolutely. Of course, they're going to be humiliated by that. But the public good clearly outweighs their personal humiliation. But in other cases, it's a harder call. When it's private individuals, when there's no crime going on, when it's merely salacious information, not so much, right? And finally, as a component of this, do I believe that this public good outweighs any other bad effects, of which there could be many, such as, for example, giving voice to a terrorist or to a criminal group or some such group as that? Again, there's a hard balancing act, because there's no question in many cases hearing their voice may give context to a story. It may inform the public. But at the same time, it gives the terrorist in question an opportunity to radicalize some foolish and easily influenced person. And you have to balance that. And all of these are very challenging, difficult things. There are no easy answers here at all. Every good journalist is faced with tough choices in any of these situations. And as a result of all of this, different journalists come to different conclusions. As I said, there are consensuses in some places about some things. So some outlets and some groups of outlets, like the American Press Associations, for example, will omit personal information from stories when that information will embarrass an innocent victim. So they leave out the names of children, they leave out the names of crime victims, sexual assault victims, that sort of thing. Some outlets do not rebroadcast the words of bad actors such as terrorists. But again, that's not universally true. And even for the people who subscribe to that theory, they make exceptions. Because you're always facing this balancing act of trying to determine whether the public good is really adequately served, such that all these potential downsides are outweighed by the public good that comes from the reporting. And of course, the consensus, any of these consensuses are by no means universal. So some reporters, some outlets actually take the opposite approach, that the more sensational and embarrassing the information may be, the more prominently they publish it, because embarrassing sensational information, however trivial a story may be, sells newspapers, and it sells airtime for television outlets. And some people are perfectly okay striking the balance in favor of selling more newspapers and being less responsible. And that's a fact of life, and it's always been a fact of life in the news business. So what's to be done about all of this? Well, again, there's no easy answers, and there's no universal answers about any of this. Every journalist has an obligation to examine their own conscience about these things and go back to some of the questions I've posed here earlier. Do I believe that this information is accurate? Again, if you don't believe it's accurate, you shouldn't be reporting it. Do I believe that the public good, remember, a reporter, a news outlet has great power, but with that comes responsibility. And that responsibility is to, at the end of the day, to the public and society. Do I believe that the public good is served by reporting this information? That's a question I think you have to ask yourself anytime you're reporting on a difficult or challenging or sensitive matter. Do I believe that this public good outweighs any damage to individuals? And we've looked at these questions before, but I believe that every reporter has a duty to ask these questions whenever they're reporting on any sensitive matter of any kind. Do I believe that this public good outweighs any damage to individuals? The answer should be yes. And sometimes there are close calls, but I think you have to weigh this one very heavily in your mind. And finally, do I believe that this public good outweighs any other bad effects, such as giving voice to a terrorist? But there could be other bad effects as well. And a journalist, I think, has an obligation when a story is sensitive, is important, to consider all of these things very carefully. And finally, and I close with this, because I think this is very important. This is the final decision, the final point that a journalist has to ponder. Am I willing to be held accountable for the effects, both good and bad, of publishing this information? Because remember, in our earlier principles, the final principle was public accountability. And I think that every reporter has to bear this in mind, that at the end of the day, they are just as accountable for what they have done and what they have said in their reporting as anybody that they're reporting on is accountable for the things that they have said and done that have gotten them into the reporting. So every reporter has to think about this. Am I willing to be accountable for the things that I have written and for the accuracy and fairness and other attributes of them and for the damage that they may do to people? Am I willing to live with that and be publicly accountable? When a journalist goes through this decision process and considers these things carefully, I think that they'll come to the right decision. We can sometimes disagree with those decisions, and we can challenge those decisions, and we should challenge those decisions because that's part of the accountability. But at the end of the day, if a journalist goes through that decision process and considers these things, and then ultimately considers this, and then they decide to move forward and publish the story, then I think that good things will happen over time, and that by and large the reporting will do the right thing, both for the news outlet, for society, and for the people in that society. And so with that, I want to close and thank you all for listening to this broadcast. I hope that it was valuable for you. I certainly enjoyed talking to you, and I will talk to you again soon. Thank you.